Hi, a video for my Year 2 Forensics. This one is for Criminology, so Unit 31. So this is what we've been doing for the last couple of months, the last term. It all centres around a timeline. Okay, so we're looking at criminological theory and punishment through time. Okay, so your timeline is obviously going to be much bigger than this, probably several pages of A3 together, or several sections where you've done them separately but then put them together. So the first section you need to start with is classicism. Now this is all the time up to this kind of 1700s, 1800s. So it doesn't just start then. It was sort of all the kind of era even before that. There were ideas, classicist ideas and theories before that. Then it sort of moves into positivism. Remember, these aren't completely definite dates. It didn't just stop on one day and start on another day. It did kind of merge where new ideas were sort of coming forward. Right realism kind of centres around Margaret Thatcher getting into power, so a conservative government. So we can kind of put a date on that. And then left realism, I've highlighted that it's Tony Blair, so more of a Labour government. So we're talking their 1990s. Okay, so this bit is obviously a lot closer together than these parts down here. So it's not a standard scale. So you first of all get your scale going and get some main dates on here. So I've got one here, the Penitentiary Act. Okay, so you need as many dates along those lines of significant events in criminology or significant world events that affected the way we view crime, criminals and punishment. Okay, so the first section is you need to just outline the theories and the people. So I've got the people here in blue. Obviously, there are other names that you could add in that you find their research interesting, but I've got some main names for you just to have a look at. And their main belief. So what was their main idea about what caused crime? Okay, so the classicist era, basically they believed that generally people were good, rational beings. Generally people that committed crime had a moral transgression. So they went against the normal moral codes that you would expect people to follow, and they make a rational choice to commit crime. So that's the general idea for classicism. Positivism coincides with the rise of science. Okay, so put that there, rise of science. And it was basically scientific reasons for criminal behaviour. So they were saying it wasn't their fault, it was inbuilt errors. So genetic errors or psychological errors or sociological conditions. So we've studied these three in Unit 34. So you've got this section in criminal psychology. So you know these three already. We've come across these three. So genetic, some sort of personality disorder we usually talk about for psychological, and sociological would be their upbringing, where they've lived, the people they've come across, and their family environment. So kind of broken homes. So you've already come across those three. They would fall into positivism. Okay. So the behaviour is determined by genetic factors, personality factors, and you can put some sociological factors in there, although we do visit that again over here. Okay, so again, still outlining the theories and the main people. So right realism was when Margaret Thatcher was in power. They basically went against positivism. So positivism said it wasn't their fault. The belief at this time, in Margaret Thatcher's kind of government time, was that it was just a lack of control. They did know what they were doing. Again, it kind of echoes back to here. They've made a choice to commit crime. They talk about a cost-benefit analysis. So if the benefit of what they're doing, the crime, the proceeds of the crime, outweighs the possible cost of getting caught, then they will commit the crime. So it does kind of link in with classicism. They go back to kind of that sort of idea. So they do ramp up the punishments again. They go for deterrence. They believe in zero tolerance and taking crime seriously. So they believed in this part, in positivism, that we were caring too much for the criminals and that we need to go back to caring for the victims. So some of the phrases that they came out with were prison works, zero tolerance, and that they were taking crime seriously. They also believed, which we'll come back to, that the cost of rehabilitation in this section was unacceptable and it had run far too much money, and we should be focusing more on the victims of crime rather than trying to help the criminals. In the last section, so we're now moving forward, we're still in realism. So these two are in the same sort of era, because obviously it's a small portion of time, but there are two definite groups of people within realism. The left realists are more about social inequalities. So the whole structure of the system, the whole structure of kind of working class, and it talks about inequality and certain groups and things like that. Jock Young is one of your main names for that to talk about. And their main kind of theory was about reducing inequality. So those are, and they didn't jump straight to prison would be the other thing, but we'll come back to that when we do penal policy, so prisons. So the first section, you're looking at the time, the theory, the names, and generally an outline of what they believed. So what kind of things did they talk about caused crime? Okay. Then you need to kind of go into a bit more detail on how the belief, so whether they believed it was a moral transgression, they believed it was science, they believed it was a lack of control, or they believed it was structural inequalities in society. How did that impact the crime control policies? So how did that impact the feeling at the time and how people were treated? Okay, so you need to go into detail on this one. So let's go back to the first era, which is the classicist era. So here, the kind of community, I want to say punishments, community control was custody, coercion and fines. So they would often fine people, they would take them into custody, and they would kind of coerce them into coming into custody or to paying a fine. Okay, so there was also some more community policies based on kind of embarrassment and deterrence. Again, harks back to over here. So these two are quite similar in their ideas. So the kind of deterrence for a community would be, we talked about this in class, sort of standing somebody on a podium in the centre of town and throwing rotten fruit at them. So remember, we're talking about a long time ago. So it would be kind of public embarrassment, putting them on the back of a cart and taking them round town. And they often had to hold a placard, a piece of cardboard or wood with their crime written on it. So they would be embarrassed publicly amongst neighbours, friends, family, as to what they had done. So it was very much on a kind of, it was an embarrassment deterrence, basically. This is what happens when you commit those crimes. Some of them did get a bit more violent, a bit more strict, sort of cutting hands off and things like that. So the punishments did get a bit more, the community punishments, because there was no real law. Obviously, we've got the Penitentiary Act coming in here, which talked about the prisons. But prior to that, there wasn't really any kind of standard law as to, if you did this, this is what will happen. So the argument there was that people didn't understand what the punishment would be. They couldn't make a cost-benefit analysis. So the argument was, when the Penitentiary Act came in and we started having laws and we started having police officers as such, paid police officers, rather than kind of just landowners fining people that walked across their land. Okay, so there was a real change there into more of a law-based approach with policemen and more of a community-based approach. But it was very much at the beginning based on custody and coercion and fines, okay, and some flogging, and that would be branding. This one, branding with like a hot iron. So if you had committed a crime, they may brand you as a criminal with a hot iron. Again, very severe crimes, and not everywhere. So not everywhere had the severe punishments. There was no standardized approach. So in one place you could get branded, and in one place you could just have a fine for the same crime. So there was no standard. Positivism, so we're talking rehab. Okay, so for both community-based policies and penal policy, so prisons, it would be the rehab, because they went together in this era. So because they believed that it wasn't their fault, they actually believed that you should help fix the criminal and you should give them treatment rather than punishment. So the community-based policies was to give them more skills. So this might happen in the community or in prison, depending on what was deemed appropriate. But they would be allocated a worker, a social worker, a psychological key worker, psychologist, all the people coming out of the war. Sort of in this era, we had the war coming to an end. We had lots of people that were unemployed, and they put them into rehab. So nurses, psychologists, teachers were put into rehab programs to help fix the issue that caused the criminality in the first place. So whether it was a lack of skills, a lack of qualifications, social inequalities, this rehab program would be designed individually to fix whichever issue of the three caused the crime in the first place. Okay, so they're learning new skills, they're being rehabilitated, they're talking, a lot of talking therapies with psychologists to get to the root of what causes the crime. So nobody was treated the same. Everybody had an individual program, which you could see where I'm going with the expense and the cost of this. Everybody had a range of experts. The problem with this, again, which you'll come to when you start extending this further, is that it was indeterminate sentences. So you didn't know how long their program was going to go on for. You didn't know how much progress they were going to make in any time. So some people viewed that as not morally correct, that the prisoners, the criminals, didn't know how long their program was going to go on for, and there was no kind of end goal in sight. Okay, community-based policies for this one. So new housing was very much being built here. Again, after the war, kind of 60s, 70s, we had a lot of social housing. So the new housing estates were built, and they were built with CCTV. Now, this disrupts the cost-benefit analysis again, because if you're on CCTV, you're more likely to be caught, and therefore the cost outweighs the benefit. So therefore people won't commit crime. That is deterrence. Okay. The zero tolerance issue that you mentioned here, and you probably just gave a brief outline, you can go into detail here. So the zero tolerance policy was every small crime will be punished. So graffiti, vandalism, again, it goes into this, ASBOs, this was continued into antisocial behaviour. So any small crime was stamped out. There was zero tolerance. They did not take any small crimes because they realised that it escalates. So people start, and we know that, people start small. They start with small crimes, graffiti, vandalism, I don't know, shooting bottles off a wall, and then it escalates to more serious crimes, so burglary, and then on and then on. So in this era, we focused on zero tolerance. So nothing will be tolerated. Everything will be picked up and punished in some way. So we've got the new housing, we've got the CCTV to disrupt the cost benefit. People know that they're going to be punished even for small crimes. So they're taking crime seriously. Again, going back to looking after the victim rather than the criminal. Okay, so that's the difference with these two. And again, we'll come back to that. So we are looking after the victims again. And that's why this was popular at the time. Too much money was being driven into helping the criminal. We need to get back to looking after the victim, and you can see why that was popular at that time. We're taking crime seriously. There's zero tolerance, and prison works. So they would pretty much put people in prison. So that's called incapacitation, because you take people out of the community. They cannot commit any more crimes, and generally they were not given any new skills. So no new skills were learned in prison, because there was possibly a belief that you give a criminal more skills, they go on to commit more crimes better. basically. So selective incapacitation, people were put in prison. Prison works, was what they said. Prison works. Let's put people in prison. It gets them out of society. They can't commit any more crimes. Fix the problem. Okay, so the combination of those, and we have gone into penal policy a little bit. So the zero tolerance, the new housing with the CCTV, disrupting the cost benefit, and the whole idea of zero tolerance itself and deterrence was their community-based policy. Left realism, you've got lots of community-based policies here. This was their focus. So I've got another one I've just realised is not on there. So you've also got PCSOs in this one. So let me just write that on. Okay. So ASBOs came in 1998, but they were removed again in 2011. So you can mention that and you could talk about the progression of that and why it was taken off. People were tagged, so wearing tags around their ankles. Community service, they were asked to do gardening or something, and usually this was in the area they live or committed crime. So again, goes back to this, and you can make the link to this embarrassment community policy here. Similar kind of idea here. Doesn't look good wearing a big jersey, usually some sort of top with big writing on the back, colourful, bright yellow, bright orange, something like that, with community payback scheme on it. So you were made to do manual labour, so you are being, you were losing, so you're losing time, you're possibly losing money if you did have a job, but the criminal is paying back to the community. And this was a big focus, was that rather than just putting them in prison, there was some sort of payback, okay? So we've got the tagging, we've got curfews, so they're expected to be in a certain time, they're electronically monitored by probation officers. You've got PCSO, so a more community-based approach, which reflects the belief here of reducing inequality. What they wanted to go back to was this kind of era here, 1960s, 70s, where you could leave your front door open. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody helped everybody, giving cups of sugar to your neighbour, that sort of idea. So they wanted to hark back to that and kind of remove this aggressive, perhaps, approach. They went back to PCSOs, having police officers walking around on your street that you can talk to and approach. So they very much brought back that, so everybody felt the same. Everybody felt part of a community and therefore less likely, hopefully, to commit crime. If they felt that they knew all their neighbours, they're less likely to steal from them. That's the idea. Neighbourhood watch, again, I always call them the curtain twitchers. So looking out, people looking out for each other, basically, noticing anything. So sort of nowadays we've got Facebook groups where we report and we talk about and we help each other out. I've got a garden gate. Does anybody want it? That sort of idea was what they wanted to get back to, this community feel. Okay, so various things there. Neighbourhood watch, PCSOs, ASBOs, tagging, community service, you've got to talk about there. This slightly less, CCTV, new housing, the cost benefit balance you could talk about, and the zero tolerance. So any small crime would be punished accordingly through sort of a scale. Here you're combining, remember, almost with the rehab, because it does go hand in hand. And here you're talking about the community-based embarrassment policies. Okay, for the next section, it's asked for penal policy. So we're talking prisons. What happened in the prison? So for this section, show how the penal policy has changed over time. So I've got that bit at the bottom here. So again, they do sort of run into each other because they do run hand in hand and they support each other. But so you can run them together if you want to. So prisons, obviously we've got this Penitentiary Act, remember, coming in, which before this time, prisons were horrible, basically. They were privately run, privately owned. Rich people owned them usually. Charged for bedding, charged for water and food, possibly. It was dreadful conditions, men and women not separated, etc. No sanitation, so no toilets, sinks, certainly no showers and washing facilities. So it was a punishment. People were asked to do hard labour, unproductive labour. That's the key thing as well. So turning the crank was one of them. So it was a huge big wheel sort of laying flat, and you would stand and you would push the crank round, and this would possibly have some create something for the rooms above, or it would just literally you just walk around and turn the crank. The whole point was it was hard, it was heavy work, it was in horrible conditions, and it was unproductive. It didn't achieve anything. You had no sense of achievement from turning the crank, and you learnt no new skills. So again, these two are linked. Remember those two links. So that was the prisons there. You can talk quite a lot about how awful the conditions were, what the Penitentiary Act was, how that came in, what that meant, and the hard labour that was going on as the punishment for the more serious crimes, and the law, when the law started to be more widespread and more uniformly applied. You can talk about that. So again, this one's probably one of the shorter ones, these two in the middle possibly. The rehab, so if people did go to prison for rehab, if they weren't on their seeing the psychologist, etc., they may be in prison and they may be learning new skills, whatever was the issue. So you could give some examples. We did them in class. Give some examples of issues and how you would fix them according to positivism. So if they had a genetic condition, if they had some learning difficulties or some social skills difficulties, you would obviously give them social skills training, anger management training. If it was a psychological issue, you would use your talking therapies, you would speak to your psychologist. So here you can give some ideas of different issues that the positivists believed caused crime, and what would be the fix, what the almost the treatment program you would give to that person to correct their criminal behaviour. Because remember, they believed that criminal behaviour could be corrected. They had faith that you could fix it, learn new skills, fix the original problem, help them, and then release them back into society, and they're no longer a criminal. So prison was used, but it was, in my kind of understanding and in my eyes, it was more of a help rather than here. I mean, it's the complete opposite to here, where it was hard labour and unproductive. Here it was very productive. Right realism. So right realisms, remember, were quite harsh, quite aggressive, quite zero tolerance, did not stand for anything. So prison was the same. You didn't learn any new skills. I mean, obviously you had the Penitentiary Act still in force, so we had to look after our people in prison, but they weren't perhaps given some of the, what can I say, home comforts that people in prison perhaps now have. They didn't really learn new skills that hadn't come in on the early part of this. It came in much later. So they may not learn new skills. They may not be trusted with being a librarian or, you know, having particular tasks in prison. It was to get them out of society. That was the main goal. Put them in prison. You can talk about here how this led to overcrowding. So we're basically throwing people in prison straight away. We're not giving them any help. There's not really any lower end of punishment. It's put them in prison. So you've got your zero tolerance before anything escalates. But once it does start escalating, there will be a prison sentence of different times, obviously, with sentences. But they will be put in prison. And this, obviously, much more prison officers were needed, but it did lead to overcrowding. And that's what we've got here. We've got overcrowded jails. Okay. So in left realism, the ones you could talk about are restorative justice. So here you talked about incapacitation, so putting people in prison with no no new skills and prospect of coming out in probably quite a long time compared to perhaps here. Here we've kind of gone down the middle. We're not as harsh as this, but we're not as helpful as this. We're somewhere in the middle. We've taken our best ideas from both. So we're putting them in prison, but we're also giving them new skills. So there will be a scale. If you're committing low-level crimes, you will be given, obviously, an ASBO, antisocial behaviour. So if you're Graffitiing, vandalism, that sort of stuff, you'll be given antisocial behaviour order. If it's perhaps escalates, you may be tagged and have a curfew. Perhaps escalates again, it'll be some sort of community payback. We've got a good example here, which you've got a sheet on, which I gave you, of restorative justice. So again, echoing this payback notion, was that you should go and see the damage you've done. You should speak to the family if they consent to it. There were programs in place called restorative justice, where you spoke to the person you'd committed crime against, and you, with the aim, I don't know how successful it is, you could talk about here, if they've got a psychological issue, would this make any difference to them, which we've talked about before? Would they understand what they have done? Would they understand the effect it's had on somebody else if they have either learning difficulties or social difficulties or psychological personality disorders? Do they understand what they've done? Do they understand the effect it's had? Do they see and feel empathy for the person who has suffered? So you can argue that one. So restorative justice, you meet the person, some sort of talking goes on, perhaps a relationship is built, and it provides closure for both, is the idea. So for the victim and for the criminal, it provides kind of a little bit of an enrichment experience, perhaps. So they try to avoid jail and try and put all of these in place. Obviously, the more severe crimes would be jail, there'd be no question. But they try to avoid it, as in this case, not here. They tried to avoid jail because of the overcrowding. So they tried to correct the overcrowding from previously, and that they would learn new skills. So again, they were harking back to this era where they were saying, let's give them some new skills so that when they are released into the community, they can get a job, which will fix this social inequality here. So they're saying that, and here, so if the person didn't have a job and that's why they committed crime, so they had inequality, they were seen as a lower class perhaps, or you could mention labelling theory here, that they were labelled as a lower class or labelled as a criminal or a vandal, that they then fulfilled that role. And if you, in prison, give them new skills, perhaps as a carpenter or electrician or something, that they could then go and have a trade. They could feel that they have done something productive, unlike here, unproductive. Something productive, they've learned something new. And the idea is they're released into society with a better empathy, perhaps, some sort of psychological talks that they've had, so they would be improved in that area. And they would have some new skills to increase their chance of getting a job and hopefully reduce this cost benefit. Okay, so that is all of the timelines. So you can see why yours will be a lot bigger than mine. Mine is just the main bullet points, so yours is going to be huge. Okay, so the last two questions that I gave you right towards the end were why realism could challenge positivism, and we did go into that, and I gave you some options of just some ideas, and you were quite free to add your own, of why this, and the people, perhaps if you imagine it, the people in government trying to get in, Margaret Thatcher and others, what arguments they could have put forward for people to not like this and not want this anymore. Okay, so obviously the cost of rehab is high, it's indeterminate sentencing, etc., etc. You can't fix everybody, etc., etc. So what were the reasons that these people in the government could put forward for people to think, we need a different approach here, this is not working? Are the recidivism rates high? So are people going and recommitting crime despite going through rehab? Obviously it's not working. So what would be your biggest reasons? Which do you think are the strongest reasons that realism came into power and challenged positivism? So why do you think this was so strong that these people obviously came into government and brought all their policies? Why do you think people started to favour these policies, in your opinion? So you could go through all the options that I've given you, some ideas, and any of your own. Talk about the positives and negatives. And then which one, perhaps paragraph at the end, which one you believe is the most important reason to reject positivism and accept what would be right realism. Okay, the last question is basically focused on this restorative justice and incapacitation and rehabilitation. So it's comparing the three. And the main thing you probably need to do here is find some sort of statistics on reoffending rates. That's kind of what we're asking, because we're evaluating how successful they were. That's really what I want you to do here. So how successful was rehab? Was it a good program? Was it, did people benefit from it? But obviously you've got that cost in there as well. So you can evaluate all of the factors that went into rehab, and what is your opinion on that? Incapacitation, putting people in prison straight away, and the whole zero tolerance. That, I believe, if you look at statistics, was shown to bring down crime. That was obviously one of their punchlines was prison works. So evaluate all of the positives and negatives of prison. So the overcrowding, cost, obviously, because they did have to expand the prisons, but obviously looking at reoffending rates to balance as to whether it worked and whether it was worth it. In this one, restorative justice is probably your main focus. So what are the benefits? Does it work? And then again, I talked about whether it would work with these people perhaps that don't have the capacity to understand what they have done. So you could talk in detail about restorative justice, give some examples. Talk about these ASBOs, how successful were they, the community service. Do people go on to reoffend after going through these? What are the rates for reoffending after these, after this, and after rehab? So that's what you're doing for that last question, is you're comparing mainly these three, because I don't think we'll have any figures on the crank and how successful the crank was. I mean, you could talk about crime numbers perhaps from classicism going into positivism if you can find them, but your main focus is this one, and left realism at the end. Okay, so I think that's everything. Hopefully that's given you enough to talk about and to crack on with this timeline and everything, all the offshoots from it.